hard to achieve. It is easier to believe in a wrong and a right with any issue, really. But life isn't that simple. There are lots of shades of gray. In my life, I often find a pull from two different directions when it comes to one of many issues that I really care about, and that's anti-Semitism. On the one hand, generally more conservative older Jews want to define anti-Semitism as a threat from the left. They define anti-Semitism on college campuses for young Jews and leave very little room for any definition that isn't theirs. On the other hand, when anti-Semitism isn't being defined within the Jewish community, it is being defined by non-Jews. Like with any oppression, this is problematic. White people don't get to define racism. Men don't get to define sexism. In the same way, non-Jews do not get to define anti-Semitism. Today, I want to redefine anti-Semitism from a young, left-wing, and Jewish perspective. Before anything, I think that there are a few important things to note about anti-Semitism. Firstly, anti-Semitism does not manifest itself in the same way as other forms of oppression. Unlike racism against black and brown people, for example, anti-Semitism relies on the idea that Jews see ourselves as better than other people. Jews are wealthy, Jews are smart, Jews run the insert any term here, banks, media, Hollywood, politics, and there are more. So anti-Semitism can be compared to the model minority myth that is often talked about in regards to Asian people. The model minority myth is the idea that Asians are smart, like the stereotype Asians are good at math. This doesn't sound like a bad thing, nor do the ideas that Jews are wealthy or well-off or smart, but they're damaging. They excuse violent anti-Semitism and make Jews feel unsafe. Secondly, I want to break down the wealthy Jew trope in more detail. This trope comes back to medieval Europe. Historically, Jews were not allowed to own land or hold jobs. The only job that Jews were allowed to own was as moneylenders because this was considered a sin for Christians. It was prohibited. So basically, Jews were forced to be bankers and were excluded from many parts of European life. Finally, I want to address the term Jew. The term Jew can be a slur given the context. I personally use the term Jew often. I describe myself and my Jewish friends as Jews. But this term can be problematic when used by non-Jews, depending on the context. So the safer thing to say, if you're a non-Jew, is to say Jewish people or Jewish person. Now, in this talk, I will use both. However, I think that it's important to note about anti-Semitism on a larger scale. That is, why is it an insult in the first place to be a Jew? What makes it insulting to be called a Jew? Now, I am Jewish, and I'm in college. I go to Earlham College right here in Richmond, Indiana. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, the daughter of academics and teachers, both Jewish and both Earlham alum. And when I was looking at colleges, I took a lot of factors into account, as many of us did, such as extracurriculars, academics, religious life, athletics, and more. Now, my college search was pretty easy. I quickly knew that I wanted a small liberal arts school and compiled a list of colleges including Oberlin, Macalester, Worcester, and other schools of the sort. Now, and I'm really sorry, Earlham, you were not my top choice for most of high school, and I made that known. Oberlin was my top choice. Now, this opinion was not popular amongst the Jewish community. Jewish adults would come up to me as soon as they found out I was interested in Oberlin and ask me how I could consider such an anti-Semitic place like Oberlin. Now, if you don't follow Jewish media on college information, you might not know that there's a list of the 40 worst colleges for Jewish students. You might ask, how do they decide who is on the list? Now, that boils down to one main issue, Israel-Palestine. Now, this talk is not about Israel-Palestine, but it does prove to be an important part of this talk. The list, as shown here, chooses colleges based on whether or not that college has taken on anti-Israel resolutions or anti-Israel sentiments, or whether or not their Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP chapter, is popular. Oberlin makes this list alongside colleges like Vassar College, University of Michigan, Brown University, and Columbia University, and many more. There are 40 of them. There's also a list of the 40 best colleges for Jewish students, and the criteria are the same. Whether or not a school is pro-Israel is the determining factor for whether or not the school makes this list. Now, both articles do address important anti-Semitic tropes, but at the end of the day, it boils down to only whether or not the school is seen as anti-Israel. But that begs the question, is it hard to be a Jew on college campuses? It is really easy to point out right-wing anti-Semitism. It's easy to point it out to my left-wing friends because it is blatant. It is pre-Holocaust reminiscent anti-Semitism. It is David Duke endorsing Donald Trump. It is shouts of Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville. It is Rothschild's conspiracies and hook-nosed Jews caricatures. And don't forget about the globalists. And no, Ivanka and Jared don't make up for that. Right-wing anti-Semitism, everyone sees. But left-wing anti-Semitism, my friends don't see. I would like to address my fellow Jews for a moment. I would like to address my fellow Jews for a moment. We need to recognize the ways in which our changing position and privilege has allowed us to help other people. Like Never Again Action, an organization that fights for the rights of undocumented people in the United States. We also need to recognize that our own oppression and allyship does not excuse pain we, indirectly or not, put onto others. Jews historically have been a part of progressive radical movements. Jews marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The women's movement of the 1960s and 70s was spearheaded by Jews Gloria Steinem and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I intend to follow in these footsteps. All that being said, I do regularly experience anti-Semitism at college. Now, before you roll your eyes, recognize that my college is not unique in this way. Nearly every single one of my Jewish friends at any school across the US experiences anti-Semitism on their campuses. Every year, when I go home for winter break, my rabbi hosts a dinner, and we all get together and talk about everything. It starts off with small talk, but once we all sit down, my rabbi asks, what happened this semester? What happened on campus? How are you feeling? And then, one by one, we go around the table and share our anti-Semitic experiences at school. My freshman year, it was the guy who called me Jewish looking, and it wasn't a compliment. My sophomore year, I got called a Zionist bitch by people on campus who I didn't know and who didn't know me or my Israel politics, and it still wouldn't be okay. And my junior year, I was called a self-hating Jew for having the audacity to criticize Israel, or the professor who referred to the rich Jews. My list goes on, and so do my friends. And the range varies greatly. There's my friend whose friend had urine thrown on them for being visibly Jewish, or my friend who got spit on for wearing a kippah in public. So the lists keep growing. Yet, left-wing anti-Semitism, my friends don't see. When I expressed what happened with the guy who called me Jewish-looking, my friends were like, why does that bother you? You do, after all, look Jewish. And what does that even mean? Jews have been seen as having big noses and red curly hair, and this idea goes back to the emigration of Jews to Europe. The Jewish people originate in North Africa and the Middle East, and a lot of these stereotypical features come from there. But more importantly, Jews are more than just one thing. There are Jews of every race and color, so not only are these stereotypes outdated, but they're also really damaging. So, let's talk about Harry Potter. So, if you can all think back to when you read Harry Potter, there are the Gringotts bankers, these goblin bankers with large noses, hook noses, and they like money. They're bankers. So, Harry Potter comes out, and everyone reads it. I read it, I love it, many people love it, but no one thinks to criticize this trope. These are Jewish characters, and they are the only Jewish characters represented in the entire Harry Potter series. Now, that is not to say that Harry Potter is left-wing anti-Semitism, but it is to point out that the left at its best excuses or doesn't address these anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes, and at its worst, it perpetuates them. In left-wing politics, too, these issues are discussed. For example, Representative Ilhan Omar, who is a part of this new millennial left-wing faction in politics, was criticized for her criticism of Israel. Now, this is problematic, but in response, Ilhan Omar wrote, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby," invoking the anti-Semitic trope of the wealthy Jew. Now, when criticized, Omar did apologize, which is more than can be said for the right, but she then continued to use other anti-Semitic language. The point is not whether or not this language was intentional. It doesn't matter. It is damaging. And it is on every individual to address all forms of oppression and be educated on all forms of oppression, especially public figures, and even more so politicians, like Representative Omar. What can make this confusing is that people and movements who say or do these things often experience oppression similar to anti-Semitism. Omar, for example, is Muslim and experiences Islamophobia. Their liberation and ours are undeniably linked. Politicians like Rashida Tlaib criticize Israel for its policies and not through anti-Semitic tropes. But this anti-Semitic language invokes the idea of a Jewish litmus test. That is, Jews need to prove whether or not we are good enough, whether or not we are left enough, by unequivocally denouncing Israel in the same way the Jewish and non-Jewish right unequivocally supports Israel. So, how can we criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic? Because it's important. How can we criticize Israel in the same way we criticize our own countries? Let's take Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel, for instance. Criticizing him, like Rashida Tlaib, for his policies and not for his big nose or globalist or whatever you want to call it, is important. Criticizing the things that Israel does is a must, especially for Jews. Let's talk about Bernie Sanders. Now, I would like to say that I am a big Bernie Sanders fan. That's a picture of me in the back. That's a poster of me with a picture of Bernie Sanders in front of my poster. And so Bernie, if you're out there watching this and you want to print it out and send it to me, please do. But that's a story for another time. So Bernie Sanders is Jewish. And people like to argue that if they are supportive of Bernie Sanders, they cannot do or say anti-Semitic things. But this is not the case. Because of the Bernie Sanders campaign, people like to sweep anti-Semitism on the left under the rug. But left-wing anti-Semitism does exist, even in a world with Bernie Sanders. So, let's talk about intersectionality. A few years ago, I was reading an article from a feminist website about all questions that all feminists need to ask on a first date to, weed out the bad scenes. So, the first few questions were fairly straightforward about reproductive rights or about sexual assault, things at the forefront of the feminist movement. But then later down the list came the question, are you a supporter of the BDS movement? The article goes on to say that if the person that you're on a date with is not a supporter of the BDS movement, you need to end all relations, no questions asked, get up from the table, leave. Now this is complicated. Israel does bad things, and the situation in Palestine, particularly Gaza, is abhorrent. But I, a Jewish American, think that BDS oversimplifies things. Now that being said, my opinion doesn't matter. That is not what this is about. My experience has been that BDS as an organization sweeps anti-Semitism under the rug. It offers a platform for anti-Semitic language to be used and doesn't address it or confront it. And so, whether or not you believe in BDS is not the point. The point is that how can we address anti-Semitism and criticize Israel? So why does this matter? And more importantly, why does this matter to non-Jews? Because the left-wing community, I truly believe, is one based on caring and justice. Wokeness has been oversimplified. Wokeness has been oversimplified, and wokeness has been used as a contest. We need to break down the ideas of wokeness as a contest and address anti-Semitism on all spaces. Our intersectionality needs to include Jews. We should all care because we care about other people, because anti-Semitism is isolating, and because our liberations are tied. The way that we can start to include Jews is by listening to Jews. Thank you.